You want to know about the winter. I have been watching people want to know about that winter for 37 years, and I will tell you something I have observed. The ones who come asking about it always want the same story. They want the cattle count, they want the temperature numbers, they want the names of the ranchers who lost everything, because those names have a weight to them that feels like history. Cole Abernethy, the Davis brothers. Walter Krantz, though Walter came back from it, which is more than some can say. Those names are in the Helena newspapers from 1887, if you want them. The newspapers did a thorough job of counting what died. They were less thorough about counting what didn't. I am 71 years old. I have run this store since my husband Heinrich built the back counter in the spring of 1879, and I have stood behind it through 6 droughts, 4 hard winters, 2 influenza seasons, and 1 war that took 4 boys from this valley and returned 2 of them changed past recognizing. I have sold supplies to people making good decisions and people making terrible ones, and I have learned that the difference between those 2 kinds of people is rarely what anyone expects. The story I am going to tell you is not in the Helena newspapers. It starts with a notebook. The notebook was small, perhaps 5 inches by 3, bound in brown leather that had gone soft with handling. The writing inside was Norwegian, which I cannot read, though I know enough German to recognize that Norwegian is its distant and more stubborn cousin. The drawings, however, required no translation. They were cross-sections, careful, measured, annotated with numbers and arrows, of structures that appeared to anyone who did not know what they were looking at to be underground. The first time I saw it was September of 1886, when Marta Solberg came into this store and set it on the counter while she found her list. I did not ask about it. You learn in 30 years of running a general store when to ask and when to look away, and the expression on Marta Solberg's face that morning was the expression of a woman who had already had every conversation she intended to have about that notebook and was not interested in having another. I sold her a piece of good oilskin, 14 cents, and she wrapped the notebook in it carefully before she put it back in her coat pocket. Then she bought rope, 2 cold chisels, a box of common nails, and 4 yards of heavy canvas. She paid in coin, counted out exactly. She thanked me. She left. I watched her walk across the road and load her purchases into the back of her wagon, and I thought 2 things. The first was that Marta Solberg moved like a woman who had made a decision and was now simply executing it, not hurrying, not hesitating, just working through the steps in the order they needed to be worked through. The second was that I had no idea what she was building and that this bothered me more than I would have expected. Let me tell you who Marta Solberg was, because the newspapers did not bother. She was 57 years old in the fall of 1886. She had come to Montana Territory from Telemark, Norway, by way of Wisconsin in 1851 when she was 22 and her father was still alive, and the family had decided, as many families decided in that decade, that the old country had offered them everything it intended to, and the new one might offer something different. Her father, Christopher Hogg, was a builder. Farmhouses, root cellars, storage structures, the practical architecture of rural survival. And he had brought with him, along with 3 trunks of tools and a wife named Ingrid and 2 children, a set of principles about construction that he had spent 40 years developing in a climate that was, in its way, just as indifferent to human comfort as Montana. Marta had married Lars Solberg in Wisconsin in 1857. Lars was a capable, quiet man who understood livestock in the particular deep way that some people understand animals, not as property to be managed, but as systems to be read. They had moved west twice, following the available land, and had settled finally on 160 acres along the Milk River in northern Montana Territory in 1871, which put them 40 miles from the Canadian border and 60 miles from the nearest town of any consequence. Lars Solberg died of pneumonia in the winter of 1882. He was 54 years old. The doctor from Chinook came too late and said there was nothing to be done and charged $4 for the visit, which Marta paid. After Lars died, people in Harlan Crossing expected Marta to sell, to go back east, to do something that made sense to them, which mostly meant doing something that reduced the number of things they would have to worry about on her behalf. She did not sell. She kept the 160 acres. She kept the 38 sheep that Lars had started and added 2 more in the spring of 1883, bringing the flock to 40. She learned the parts of the operation that Lars had handled, and she managed the parts she had always handled, and she did this alone, without complaint, for 4 years. The valley tolerated this. Barely. Marta Solberg occupied an uncomfortable position in the social geography of the Milk River country. She was a sheep rancher in cattle territory, which made her already an outsider by the logic of the range. She was a widow running her own operation without a son or a hired hand, which made her an anomaly. She was not unfriendly, but she was not social either, which meant she had no natural allies among the women of the community who might have smoothed her path. She managed, in other words, by being difficult to categorize, and therefore eventually by being left alone. This suited her. The summer of 1886 was hot and dry, and in the way of that particular combination, deceptively comfortable. The grass cured early. The river ran lower than usual, but ran. The sky stayed blue past any reasonable expectation. It was the wool that told her first. I know this because she mentioned it to me in passing. August, she came in for sugar and coffee. And it is the kind of thing I notice because I notice most things that come across this counter and write very few of them down. She said the wool on her flock was coming in dense, unusually dense and unusually early. She said she had been watching it since July. I nodded, the way you nod when someone tells you something that you don't know how to evaluate. She bought her sugar and her coffee and she left, and I thought nothing more about it until a week later, when a trader passing through from Helena mentioned, as he was settling his account, that the geese had been moving south since the first week of August, which was 3 weeks ahead of schedule in his experience. He mentioned it the way a person mentions weather, as a fact, without implication, a piece of the world's ordinary information. He moved on the next morning. I watched him go and felt something I could not name. Marta had already named it. She had gone home from my store in August and taken the notebook out of the coat pocket where it lived, and she had opened it for the first time in nearly 10 years, and she had begun to read what her father had written in the winter of 1850, just before the family left Norway, about how animals know before men, and men should be ashamed but not surprised by this, and what to do when the animals are telling you something you need to hear. She told me years later that she had stood at her window that August evening reading her father's words while her 40 sheep moved, one by one, to settle for the night against the base of the sandstone shelf that ran along the northern edge of her property. They did this every winter. She had watched them do it for 15 years. She had never, until that evening, understood why. The sandstone shelf was perhaps 3 meters high and ran east to west for 40 yards along the edge of Marta's grazing land. It was unremarkable to look at. Rough-faced, weathered to a gray-orange color, interrupted in one place by a shallow recess where the stone had fractured and settled at some point before any white settler had stood in that valley. The recess was perhaps 10 feet wide and 4 feet deep. It caught morning light from the southeast. It was worth nothing as far as anyone in Harlan Crossing was concerned. You could not graze cattle against it. You could not farm the thin soil at its base. It blocked nothing useful and sheltered nothing that anyone had identified as worth sheltering. What Marta Solberg understood, reading her father's notebook in August of 1886, was that the sandstone shelf was porous and dense in the particular combination that causes stone to absorb heat slowly through summer and release it slowly through winter. That the ground at its base, sheltered from wind and warmed by both the stone above and the geothermal stability of the earth below, would hold a temperature through January that the open field 40 feet away would not see again until April. Her sheep had known this since the first winter she brought them to that land. They had been sleeping against that shelf every January for 15 years, crowding into the warmest place available to them, because animals do not theorize about warmth, they simply find it. Marta had watched them do this for 15 years and called it habit. That August evening, she understood it was information. She began digging in September. I heard about it the way I heard about most things in those years, from the people who came through my store and could not resist the particular pleasure of sharing news they found remarkable. Frank Aldrich, who ran cattle on the east side of the valley, mentioned it first. He had ridden past Marta's property and seen her in the field with a pickaxe, breaking ground at the base of the sandstone shelf. "Building a root cellar?" I asked. "Bigger than that," Frank said. "And in the wrong direction for a root cellar, opening faces south." Dorothy Krantz, Dot, everyone called her, came in 2 days later and asked if I knew what Marta Solberg was constructing. "I sold her rope and cold chisels in September," I said, "and oilskin before that, and canvas." Dot looked at me with the expression she used when she felt I was being deliberately unhelpful. "She's digging a structure into the hillside, Agnes. Walter rode past it yesterday. She's going to put the sheep in it." "Underground?" "Partially. She's framing it with timber, and she's cutting into the base of that sandstone formation she has on the north end." Dot set her purchases on the counter. "I'm going to go speak with her." "What will you say?" Dot was quiet for a moment, organizing her words the way a practical woman organizes a pantry, by usefulness, and by the order in which things will be needed. "I'll say that people are talking, because they are. Frank told half the valley before he told you, and you know Frank." I did know Frank. "They're calling it a grave," Dot said. "Some of them. The kinder ones are saying she's been alone too long and it's affected her judgment." She paid for her goods. At the door she paused. "I don't think she's lost her judgment," Dot said. "I think she's doing something I don't understand, which is different." She thought about this. "Though I'm not sure it matters to the people doing the talking." She left. I stood behind my counter and looked at the oilskin-wrapped notebook I had seen Marta lay on this same surface 3 weeks before, and I thought about what Frank Aldrich had said. Opening faces south. There was a reason for that. I did not know what it was yet, but there was a reason. There is a thing that happens in a general store that does not happen in most other places, which is that you see the shape of a community's thinking before the community itself sees it. People buy in patterns. A man who is planning to winter his cattle differently than he wintered them last year buys different things in September than he bought in September the year before. A woman preparing for a harder season than the one she expects officially buys more of certain items and less of others. These patterns are not secret. The people making them are not trying to conceal anything, but they are not visible to anyone except the person standing behind the counter watching them accumulate. I stood behind that counter for 31 years. I watched patterns. What I watched in September and October of 1886 was this. Every rancher in the Milk River Valley bought supplies consistent with preparing for a winter like the last 3 winters, which had been cold but manageable. Standard quantities of lamp oil, standard quantities of salt pork and dried beans, hay contracted at standard rates, the usual order of things carried out by people who had survived previous winters by doing what they had always done, and who had no reason to believe the next winter would require anything different. Marta Solberg bought cold chisels, rope, canvas, oilskin, and 200 common nails. She came back in October for a draw knife, a small keg of lard, and 6 yards of heavy wool blanket material that I happened to have left over from the previous season. She examined the blanket material carefully before she bought it, holding it up to the light from the window and pressing it between her fingers to gauge the density of the weave. "Is it for the house?" I asked, which was the closest I could come to asking what I actually wanted to ask. "The walls," Marta said. I waited because sometimes people mean the same thing by different words. Not the house walls, she said, and set the fabric on the counter to be measured and cut. I cut it. I said nothing more, but I wrote it in my ledger that evening, under her name, with a small notation beside it that I did not use for other customers. Purpose unclear. It was the first time I had written that notation in 11 years of keeping that ledger. It would not be the last time I wrote it beside Marta Solberg's name. To understand what she was building, you first have to understand what her father taught her. And to understand what her father taught her, you have to go back to Telemark, Norway, in the winter of 1843, when Marta was 14 years old and Christopher Hogg was about to build something his neighbors had never seen. Marta told me about this in pieces over many years, a detail here, a memory there, and I assembled it the way you assemble anything that arrives in fragments, which is carefully and with the understanding that the gaps are part of the picture. Christopher Hogg was not a man who explained things in words if he could explain them in actions. This was not stubbornness, or not only stubbornness. It was a philosophy of learning that he had arrived at through 40 years of building things that either worked or didn't, and had observed that people who learned by doing retained the lesson in a different place in the body than people who learned by being told. Deeper, he believed, less removable. The winter Marta was 14, he decided to build a structure for the farm's sheep that was unlike the timber barn they had been using. The existing barn was sound. Christopher had built it himself 12 years earlier, but it required wood to heat it through the worst of January, and wood in that valley was not unlimited, and Christopher was a man who thought 30 years ahead and did not like what he saw when he looked at the wood supply. He took Marta to a hillside on the eastern edge of their land, one morning in October, the ground still workable, the first serious frost 3 weeks away. He did not explain where they were going or why. He handed her a pickaxe, and he picked up a spade, and he began to dig. She dug beside him because he was her father, and you dug when your father dug, and for 2 hours neither of them said anything. When they had opened a hole perhaps 4 feet deep and 6 feet wide at the base of the hillside, Christopher set down his spade. He reached into the hole and took up a handful of soil from the bottom of it and held it out toward Marta. She took it. She held it in her palm. It was warm, not dramatically warm. Not warm the way a stone left in afternoon sun is warm, warm the way a living thing is warm, steady, quiet, present. She looked at her father. He said nothing. He handed her the spade and picked up the pickaxe and kept digging. She told me, 60 years later, that she understood in that moment more about what he was building than she would have understood if he had talked to her for an hour. The earth, below the reach of the frost line, was not cold. It had stored the summer, slowly, over months, the way a thick wall stores warmth from a fire, and was releasing it slowly, the way a thick wall releases it. The sky had given up its heat in October. The ground had not. Christopher Hogg built the Georgestall that fall. It took 6 weeks. Marta helped at every stage, digging, fitting stone, cutting timber, packing the roof with the mixture of earth and dry dung and straw that her father had arrived at through 20 years of trial in Norwegian winters. She did not understand everything she was doing at the time. She was 14, and understanding everything was not the point. The point, which she would not fully grasp for another 43 years, was that she would remember it when she needed it. What she remembered, standing in front of her sandstone shelf in August of 1886 with her father's notebook open in her hands, was not a set of instructions. There are no instructions in that notebook as far as I understand it. What there are principles, stated briefly, sometimes only as a sentence or two, and then drawings. The drawings are precise in the way of someone who has built things and knows that drawings that are not precise are more dangerous than no drawings at all. The principle that governed everything else was this, which Marta translated for me from the Norwegian sometime in the early 1890s. The earth does not forget summer as quickly as the sky. Build below the sky's memory. Build within the earth's. The second principle concerned sighting. Not every piece of ground holds the same temperature at depth. Stone holds longer and more evenly than clay. South-facing slopes receive more solar energy through winter than north-facing ones, and that energy travels downward over time. A structure built against existing stone on a south-facing exposure, sheltered from the prevailing wind, sits at the intersection of everything the earth has to offer. The sandstone shelf on Marta's property ran east to west. Its southern face caught the low winter sun from 9 in the morning until 2 in the afternoon. At its base, the ground was partly sheltered from the north wind that came straight off the Canadian prairie with nothing to interrupt it for 40 miles. And it was sandstone, porous, dense, the specific combination that her father had written about in a single line. Stone that breathes will hold longer than stone that doesn't. Find the kind that breathes. She had 160 acres, and this shelf was on it. She had her father's notebook, and it described, in principle, exactly what this shelf was. She had 15 years of watching her sheep press against the base of that stone every January, choosing it over the open field without being directed, without being rewarded, choosing it because they were cold, and the stone was less cold than anything else available to them. She had not invented this knowledge. She had inherited part of it and observed part of it and been standing in front of the confirmation of it for 15 years without knowing what she was seeing. In September, she began to dig. The first hole was wrong. She spent 6 days on it before she understood why. 6 days of breaking ground and moving stone and hauling the excavated material away in the small cart she used for moving soil around the kitchen garden. The hole was in the right location, against the base of the shelf near the eastern end where the recess in the stone gave her a partial back wall already formed by nature. The depth was right. The width was right. The orientation was wrong. She discovered this the way her father had taught her to discover things, by watching rather than measuring. She spent 2 mornings sitting on a flat stone 20 feet from the dig site, watching the light move across the face of the sandstone shelf from sunrise to midday. What she observed was that the angle she had chosen for the entrance, facing roughly east-southeast, would give her morning light, but would surrender it by 11 o'clock when the sun moved past the angle of the overhang above. A structure that lost its sun at 11 in the morning in January would be relying on the Earth's stored heat alone from late morning through the rest of the day. That was workable in October. In February, when the stored heat had been drawn on for 4 months, it was not enough. She needed the entrance to face more directly south, closer to due south than she had allowed for, angled to catch the low winter sun at its highest point, which in January in northern Montana is not high at all, and every degree of it mattered. She spent one evening with the notebook, checking her father's notations on angles and exposures. Then she spent one morning confirming what she had observed about the light. Then she filled in the first hole. I found out about this later, much later, when Marta happened to mention it in the context of explaining the finished structure to someone else. She mentioned it without particular emotion, the way you mention having taken a wrong road and corrected your course. 6 days of work, abandoned. She had simply begun again. The second hole was in the right place. It was while she was working on the second excavation on a morning in late September that she encountered Ruth Beartooth. Ruth lived at the eastern edge of the settled land, in a small house that her husband, a French trapper named Celestin Beartooth, dead 7 years, had built against a low rise in the ground with his back to the prevailing wind. The house was practical and almost invisible from the road, which had been Celestin's preference and remained Ruth's. She gathered from the land around it through every season, and she sold or traded what she gathered in town with a regularity and a matter-of-factness that most people in Harlan Crossing had long since stopped thinking about. She had her granddaughter with her that morning, a small girl of 7 or 8 named Clara, who was helping carry a basket of wild turnip root from the riverbank. Marta did not know them well. They were neighbors in the large sense that everyone within 20 miles is a neighbor in that country, but their lives did not intersect in the ordinary ways. Ruth stopped at the edge of the dig site and looked at it without speaking. Marta kept working. She had grown accustomed to people stopping to look at the dig site and had found that saying nothing was usually the most efficient response. After a moment, Ruth said, "What are you building?" "A shelter for my sheep," Marta said. "Dug into the base of the stone." Ruth was quiet again. She looked at the sandstone shelf, at the angle of the excavation, at the pile of displaced earth and rock to one side. Then she set down her half of the basket and walked along the base of the shelf, east toward the recess in the stone. She stopped at a point perhaps 15 feet from where Marta had begun digging. She crouched and pressed her palm flat against the ground. She held it there for a moment. Then she stood and said, "Here. My grandmother kept her winter stores here. The ground does not freeze here, not even in January." She paused. "There is a reason the deer sleep here in the mornings." Marta set down her pickaxe. She walked to where Ruth was standing and crouched, as Ruth had crouched, and pressed her own palm against the ground. She held it there for a long time. Then she stood and looked at the sandstone face above that spot. The angle of it, the exposure, the way the stone had fractured and settled precisely where Ruth's grandmother had understood it would be worth knowing. The location was 12 feet from where Marta had chosen to dig, and it was better. The stone above it angled in a way that would direct additional solar gain downward. The ground beneath her palm was measurably warmer than the ground she had been excavating. Ruth's grandmother had known this. Ruth knew this. Marta's sheep had known this and demonstrated it every January for 15 years, and she had been 12 feet away from the right place the entire time. She picked up her pickaxe. She looked at Ruth. "Thank you," she said. Ruth picked up her end of the basket. Clara picked up the other end, watching Marta with the steady, open attention of a child who has not yet learned to look away from things that interest her. Ruth nodded once, and they went on toward town. Marta moved her dig site 12 feet to the east and began again. October in the Milk River Valley has a particular quality of light that I have never heard anyone describe adequately, including myself. It is not the golden light of September, which is generous and still warm at midday. It is something colder and more horizontal, a light that comes in low across the prairie and illuminates things from the side rather than above, so that every fence post and every furrow and every line of a building casts a shadow longer than itself, and the whole landscape looks like it is being examined rather than simply lit. It is the light of a country preparing for something. In October of 1886, I watched that light move across my store windows every afternoon, and I thought about Marta Solberg working at the base of her sandstone shelf. And I thought about the geese I had watched moving south since August, and I thought about the trader from Helena who had mentioned it so casually and moved on. I am not a superstitious woman. I was not then, and I am not now. But there is a difference between superstition and attention, and I had been paying attention to enough things that autumn to feel a low, persistent unease that I could not attribute to any single cause. I sold standard winter supplies to the valley's ranchers through October, and I wrote the sales in my ledger in the ordinary way, and I said nothing to anyone about what I was feeling, because a general store owner who tells her customers that she has a bad feeling about the coming winter is a general store owner who has fewer customers by spring. Some knowledge you carry quietly. That is not dishonesty. That is the particular discipline of people whose livelihood depends on other people's trust. The excavation was finished by the 1st of October. What Marta had created at the base of the sandstone shelf in the location Ruth Beartooth had identified was a space approximately 22 feet long and 14 feet wide, with a depth that varied from 6 feet at the entrance end to slightly more than 7 feet at the back where the shelf's own stone formed the north wall. The floor was hard-packed earth, and the south wall was open, where the framed entrance would be built. The stone behind and above Sandstone. 3 meters of it porous and dense. The ground below, earth at stable temperature, already warming the air inside the excavation noticeably above the temperature of the open field. On the morning Marta finished the excavation, she told me this years afterward, as a footnote to something else we were discussing, she stood in the opening of the empty hole and felt the air around her legs and noted that it was warmer than the air at her face, which was exposed to the October morning. She crouched down and let the warmer air collect around her hands. Her father had been right. She went home and ate breakfast and came back with timber and began to build. The framing went up in 2 stages. The first stage was the support structure for the roof, the most critical element because the roof would carry 18 inches of compacted earth and a layer of mixed dung and straw on top of that, and the weight of that material in wet conditions, or under snow load, was not trivial. Christopher Haug's notebook contained a page of calculations on roof loading that Marta had studied carefully before she began, running her finger under the Norwegian figures and working through the arithmetic herself, checking it against what she knew about timber strength from a lifetime of watching things built and occasionally watching them fail. She used the soundest timber from Lars's old barn, the posts and cross beams from the north and west walls, which had been sheltered and had stayed dry. The rest of the barn she left standing as a windbreak to the northwest of the new structure, which was not its original purpose, but would serve well enough as one. The beams went in correctly. She was precise about this, measuring twice and cutting once in the manner her father had insisted upon, and the framing was square and solid within 4 days. The second stage was the roof deck itself, the surface onto which the insulating layers would be laid. Here she used rougher, lighter material, boards salvaged from an outbuilding that had collapsed 2 winters before, supplemented by split poles cut from the cottonwoods along the river. She laid these across the beams close together, leaving gaps no wider than her thumb, and over them she spread a layer of the heavy canvas she had bought from me in September, pinned down at the edges with wooden battens. The canvas was the waterproofing layer. Without it, moisture from the earth above would migrate downward through the roof deck and into the living space below. Moisture was the enemy of everything she was building, not because the structure couldn't handle damp, but because a wet earthen roof weighs considerably more than a dry one, and the difference between a load the timbers could carry and a load they could not was a difference she did not intend to discover in January. Over the canvas went the earth, 18 inches of it, compacted in layers, taken from a borrow pit she had opened 30 feet to the east of the structure so as not to disturb the thermal properties of the ground immediately adjacent. She moved this earth in the small cart, load by load, over 3 days. By the end of the 3rd day, her shoulders had developed a specific deep ache that she described to me years later as the kind of pain that is at least honest about what caused it. Over the earth went the insulating layer. This was her father's particular invention, or rather, his particular refinement of something older, a mixture of dry sheep dung and straw, applied in a layer approximately 6 inches deep and packed moderately firm. The dung, when thoroughly dry, contained air pockets throughout its structure. Air, trapped and still, is among the finest insulators available in nature. The straw added fiber and prevented the mixture from compacting under its own weight into something too dense to do its work. Together they formed a layer that resisted cold transmission better than earth alone, better than wood, better than almost anything Marta could have applied to that roof using materials she had within a mile of her property. It was not, as she acknowledged, a pleasant material to work with. She did not mention this as a complaint. She mentioned it as a fact, with the tone of a woman who has spent 40 years in the company of sheep and has long since made her peace with what that entails. The walls presented a different challenge. The north wall needed none. The sandstone shelf provided it, solid and thick, and already performing the thermal function she needed from it. The east and west walls she built from stone, dry-laid in the manner her father had used for the Georgestall in Telemark. No mortar, just careful fitting, each stone chosen for how it sat against its neighbors, the whole held by weight and friction and the precision of the selection rather than by any adhesive. Mortar cracks in hard cold. Dry stone moves slightly but does not fail. She had watched her father explain this to a skeptical neighbor in Norway by pressing his thumbs between two dry-laid stones and showing how they gave just barely under pressure before returning, and she applied the same principle in Montana 43 years later, without the skeptical neighbor, but with the same result. The south wall was the entrance structure, and this was the element that cost her the most thought. She needed two things from the entrance: light and thermal integrity. A single door would provide neither adequately. It would let in cold every time it opened, and it would not create the barrier she required between the interior climate and the exterior one. What she needed was what her father called in his notebook a luftloom, an air pocket, a buffer zone between two temperatures. She built two doors, framed 4 feet apart, with the space between them closed on the sides and top. The outer door was heavy, 2-inch planking, packed on its interior face with a layer of dry grass bales that she changed out monthly. The inner door was lighter, intended mainly to be opened and closed quickly. The 4 feet of air between them, undisturbed and still, would insulate as effectively as 6 inches of packed straw. To build this double entrance, she needed more lumber than she had. She stood in her house one evening, looking at the interior wall between the small bedroom and the main room, and made a calculation. The wall was not structural. It was a partition, comfort, and privacy, both of which were less urgent than keeping 40 sheep alive through January. She dismantled it the following morning, working carefully to preserve the boards intact, and used the lumber to complete the entrance framing. Her house was colder after that. She did not mention this to anyone. I found out about it in November, when she bought a second blanket from me, and I asked if everything was all right at home. "Drafty," she said, "I made some adjustments." I did not ask what adjustments. I wrote it in the ledger. The floor required more thought than she had initially given it. 40 sheep in an enclosed space produce heat, which was the point. But they also produce moisture, from breath, from body warmth, from the ordinary biological processes of animals living in close quarters. Moisture accumulating in a compacted earth floor over 4 months would produce standing water by February, and standing water in a geothermal shelter would wick cold upward through the ground faster than almost anything else, undermining the very principle the structure depended upon. She solved this with sand. She laid 4 inches of coarse river sand over the compacted earth of the floor, raked level, and then raked slightly, a half-inch drop across each 10 feet of floor length toward the entrance. Water, given a surface to move on and a direction to move toward, will do so without being asked. The sand would absorb what moisture it could. What it could not absorb would move slowly toward the entrance and out. She would refresh the sand in the areas nearest the animals once a month. The sand she hauled from the river in the same small cart she had used for the earth. It took 2 days. When she was finished, she stood in the center of the floor of the completed structure and turned slowly, looking at what she had built. South wall, the double entrance, framed and hung, gap sealed with rendered lard pressed into the joints with a paddle. North wall, the sandstone shelf, solid and already faintly warm to the touch even in October. East and west walls, dry-laid stone, tight and square. Roof, timber, canvas, 18 inches of earth, 6 inches of dung and straw. Floor, compacted earth under 4 inches of coarse sand, with a ventilation pipe, a 3-inch section of salvaged stovepipe, angled up through the roof at the eastern end, positioned to exhaust at the exterior beneath a flat stone she had mortared at an angle to deflect direct wind and snow away from the opening. The interior temperature, when she stood in the center of it that October afternoon with both doors closed, was noticeably warmer than outside. Not dramatically, but noticeably. The way a hand is noticeably warmer than the air around it. She went home and made supper, and came back the next morning with her 40 sheep. The trouble with the roof came on the third night after the flock went in. She had checked the structure at midday and found nothing to concern her. She checked it again at dusk, moving through the outer door and the inner door and standing in the space with the animals while her eyes adjusted to the dimness, feeling the air temperature and listening to the sounds the sheep made and watching how they were distributed through the space. They had already sorted themselves, the older ewes along the south wall near the entrance, where the air moved slightly. The younger animals clustered toward the north wall against the sandstone. She was turning to leave when she looked up at the northeast corner of the roof and saw the sag. It was perhaps 3 inches of deflection over a span of 4 feet, enough to be visible, but not enough to be imminent. The earth above that corner was slightly wetter than she had known, retaining more moisture than the rest of the roof material, and the weight of it was pressing down on a junction between 2 boards that she had not reinforced as heavily as the main spans. She stood in the dimness for a moment, calculating. 3 inches now. The full winter load. Snow on top of the earth, rain before the snow, the repeated freezing and thawing of the early cold, could bring it to 6 inches, which was where timber failed. She went to the house. She found Lars's old fence posts in the pile behind the collapsed outbuilding. 4 of them, sound enough, dried for 2 winters. She carried them back to the structure 2 at a time. She worked through the night. What she was building was a secondary support. 2 posts set vertically on flat stones on the floor connected by a horizontal beam cut to length from the fence post timber positioned to bear against the underside of the roof structure at the weak junction. It was not elegant. It was not what her father would have drawn in the notebook. But it was what the materials allowed and the situation required, and by the time the October dawn came gray through the gap between the outer and inner doors, the corner of the roof had risen half an inch under the pressure of the new support and was holding. She sat on the floor of the George stall, with her back against the sandstone wall, and her 40 sheep arranged around her in the early light, and she was too tired to move, and so she stayed there. At some point she slept. When she woke, the air was still warm. The animals were eating from the hay she had put out the night before, moving around her feet with the comfortable indifference of creatures who have decided a person is simply part of the landscape. The northeast corner of the roof was holding. She went home. She ate. She came back to check the structure at midday. She did not tell anyone about the night's work. Not because she was ashamed of the trouble. Trouble in construction is not shameful. It is inevitable. But because the telling would have required more explanation than the event deserved, and she had building left to do. The first hard frost came in the last week of October. I noticed it first in what people bought. The quantities shifted. People came in for extra lamp oil, for another sack of dried beans, for whatever small comfort items they had been putting off purchasing. The cold had become real rather than anticipated, and real cold has a way of clarifying what matters. By early November, the temperatures at night were dropping into the single digits. Not exceptional for this valley, we had seen worse, but early. 3 weeks earlier than the previous 2 winters, if my records were right, and my records are always right. The geese were long gone. The river was running low and dark, the color it turns when it is deciding whether to freeze. And on a Saturday morning in the first week of November, a rancher named Ed Polly came into the store to buy lamp oil and mentioned, without particular emphasis, that he had seen a coyote moving south along the ridge above his property at mid-morning, moving in the steady, unhurried way of an animal that is not hunting but traveling, covering ground with a purpose. Coyotes do not move south in November. They are year-round residents. They do not migrate. I poured his lamp oil and made change and said nothing. But I thought about Marta's sheep pressing against the sandstone shelf every January. I thought about the geese in August. I thought about the trader from Helena. I thought about 40 animals in a structure dug into the earth, above which, that very morning, The sky was the particular shade of white-gray that means the clouds are full and waiting. I thought, something is coming. I did not know yet what 48 degrees below zero felt like. None of us did. We were about to learn. The first storm came in November and was bad enough that people stopped making jokes about the underground barn. Not because they had changed their minds about it. People do not change their minds quickly, and they change them least quickly when the thing they are being asked to reconsider is something they have already said out loud in public. They stopped making jokes because the storm occupied their attention entirely, the way serious cold always does. It narrows the world down to the immediate and the necessary, and there is no room left in a narrowed world for jokes about a neighbor's peculiarities. The temperature dropped to 20 below zero on the second night of that first storm. The wind was out of the northwest, which in that valley means it has come straight off the Canadian prairie without interruption, and it carried ice crystals that moved horizontally rather than falling, so that being outside in it was less like being in a snowstorm and more like being inside something that was trying to sand you down to nothing. I kept the store open because someone had to, and because the store was the warmest building in Harlan Crossing, and people needed somewhere to be that wasn't their own four walls. They came in and stood by the stove and said very little, and after a while they went back out into it and returned to their own properties and their own animals. Cole Abernethy lost 12 cattle in the first storm. He mentioned this to me when he came in for lamp oil on the fourth day, and he mentioned it the way a man mentions a bad hand of cards, not devastated, not yet, just noting the loss and moving forward. He had hundreds more. 12 was a bad week, not a catastrophe. Walter Krantz lost 9. Marta Solberg lost none. I know this because she came in on the 6th day, after the storm had broken, and the temperature had risen back to something survivable. And she bought coffee and a small amount of sugar, and she looked tired, but not the way a person looks tired when things have gone wrong. She looked tired the way a person looks tired when they have been doing a great deal of necessary work and the work has done what it was supposed to do. I did not ask directly. I said, "How did they come through?" "Fine," she said. "They're arguing about the corners again." I looked at her. "The warm corners," she said. "They have preferences. They make their feelings known." She almost smiled. I have mentioned this before, and I will not belabor it, but in 30 years of knowing Marta Solberg, I counted her genuine smiles the way a careful person counts something valuable, and that one was among them. The second storm came in December. It was worse. The temperature on the second night reached 35 below, and the wind was continuous, not gusting, but steady, a sustained force that pressed against the sides of buildings and found every gap and transmitted cold through every material that was not several feet of packed earth or solid stone. I could hear it from inside the store with the stove burning and the door sealed, a low, constant note that was less a sound than a presence. Walter Krantz lost 22 more cattle. Cole Abernethy lost 31. There was a particular silence in the store that week that I had not heard before. Not the silence of a storm keeping people indoors, but the silence of people revising their arithmetic. The numbers were becoming serious. Not yet catastrophic, these were men who could absorb significant losses and continue, but serious enough that the revision showed in their faces when they came to buy supplies. Nobody mentioned Marta's structure. This, too, was a kind of acknowledgement. The third storm began on the 8th of January. I know the date precisely because I wrote it in the ledger, which I do not usually do with weather events. I wrote it because from the first hour of that storm, something felt different. The weight of it, the completeness of it, the way the light went, not just gray, but the particular flat white that means the sky has decided to be a ceiling and intends to remain one. It lasted 3 days. The temperature reached 48 below zero, which I know from the thermometer that Heinrich had mounted on the exterior of the store's north wall in 1881, a good German thermometer that he had brought from Milwaukee and trusted with his life. 48 below. The mercury went to the bottom of the range, marked on the glass, and stayed there, and for all I know, it wanted to go further. I did not leave the building for 61 hours. I burned through more hardwood in those 3 days than I had burned in the previous 6 weeks. I ate what was in the back room: dried beef, crackers, a jar of preserved pears that Heinrich had put up in 1883, and that I had been saving without any clear idea of what I was saving them for. I ate the pears on the second night of the storm by lamplight, with the wind pressing against every wall of the building, and they were very good. And I thought about a great many things. I thought mostly about the valley around me, the ranches dispersed across it, the animals in the barns and sheds that had been built the way barns and sheds had always been built in this country, timber-framed and wood-heated and exposed on every wall to 48 degrees below zero. I thought about what that temperature does to a barn. I thought about what it does to the animals inside a barn, and what it does to the people who cannot reach those animals through the storm. I thought about an earthen structure dug into the base of a sandstone shelf, with walls of stone and dry-laid rock, and a roof of compacted earth and dry dung that was at this moment covered with 6 feet of drifted snow, which was not, from the structure's perspective, a problem, but a layer of additional insulation. I thought, her sheep are warm. I was right, all 40 of them. What happened to Marta on the second night of that storm is something she told me years afterward, simply and without drama, and I have tried to tell it the same way, because it deserves that. She woke at 2 in the morning because something in the quality of the silence had changed. Not louder, silences do not become louder, but different, in the way that a person who has been responsible for animals long enough learns to parse the specific silence that means nothing is wrong, from the specific silence that means something has been wrong for long enough that the animals have stopped responding to it. She dressed. She went out. The exterior vent pipe, the 3-inch salvage stovepipe that exhausted through the roof, was completely blocked, not partially, completely. The stone cap she had mortared at an angle to deflect wind and snow had held through 2 storms. The third storm was not 2 storms. The drifting had buried it entirely, packed solid, no passage for air in either direction. She climbed onto the roof, at 48 below zero, alone, 57 years old. She told me it took 11 minutes to clear the pipe. She knew this because she counted, not from bravado, but because counting gave her mind something to do that was not the cold, which was the most complete cold she had ever experienced, the kind that is not a temperature, but a reclassification of what the body is for. She cleared the pipe with a length of iron rod she had carried up with her, working by feel in the darkness, and when the blockage broke free she felt the change in the pipe immediately, the slight pressure of air beginning to move again. She climbed down. She went through the outer door and the inner door and sat on the floor of the George stall with her back against the sandstone wall until she was warm. Her 40 sheep arranged themselves around her in the darkness, with the comfortable authority of animals who have decided that a person sitting on their floor is simply a feature of the floor. After a while she went back to the house. She redesigned the stone cap the following week, adding a secondary baffle that would prevent complete burial under any drift she could calculate. She did not tell anyone about the night on the roof. I found out about it in 1893 as a footnote to a conversation about something else entirely. In the spring, when the ground released and the counting was done, Cole Abernethy had lost 340 cattle. The Davis brothers had lost their entire herd. Walter Krantz had lost 55 of 80. 11 families in the valley had lost more than half of what they had entered winter with. Marta Solberg had lost 0. The mathematics required no interpretation. In a community of people who understood arithmetic as the primary language of survival, 0 was a complete sentence. Dot Krantz came to the George stall on a Thursday in February, before the worst of the accounting was finished, before the full shape of the winter's damage was clear. She came alone. She had not told anyone she was coming, and she did not explain herself when she arrived. She stood at the outer door of the structure for a moment, then knocked. Marta opened the inner door. The warmth came out. Not dramatic, not astonishing. Simply the warmth of a closed space in which 40 living animals had been breathing and generating heat for 4 months. The smell of wool and earth and hay. Dot looked past Marta into the dimness where the sheep moved and settled in the particular unhurried way of animals that have no reason to be anxious. She did not apologize. She did not acknowledge the autumn's conversation, or the jokes she had heard and not contradicted, or the 11 weeks during which she had found Marta's project more embarrassing than interesting. She said, "How did you build this?" Marta got the notebook. They sat in the doorway, warm air on one side, February on the other, and Marta explained. The siding, the roof construction, the double entrance, the floor drainage, the ventilation. She explained slowly and in order, the way her father had taught her things should be explained, from principle to application, never the reverse. At one point, Dot asked about the sandstone shelf, why that location specifically, and Marta told her about Ruth Beartooth, about Ruth's grandmother's winter storage, about the deer and the frost patterns in March. She said Ruth's name clearly, as a source, as the origin of the most critical piece of knowledge the whole structure rested upon. Dot was quiet for a moment. "I'll need to speak with her," Dot said. Marta nodded. Whether Dot ever did, I cannot say with certainty. I know she listened when Marta said it. In my experience of that community, in that time, that was not a small thing. By the spring of 1888, there were 7 George stalls in the Milk River Valley. No 2 of them were identical. Each person who built one had adapted the principles to their own land, their own stone, their own materials, their own reading of where the frost came first and where it gave up last. That variation was the proof, if proof beyond the sheep count were needed, that the idea had been understood and not merely copied. James Abernethy built the first one on his father's land in the fall of 1887 on a south-facing exposure he had identified by walking the property in March and watching where the snow retreated first. He had come to Marta in April with a blank notebook, and she had spent 2 hours with him, and at the end she had told him, "Start where the snow goes first." He did. Cole Abernethy did not come. I want to be accurate about this, and I want to be fair about it, because accuracy and fairness are not always the same thing. He did not come, and I do not believe it was pride exactly. I believe the winter had taken something from him that was not simply cattle, and that the shape of what remained did not include the particular capacity required to sit across from Marta Solberg and ask her to teach him something. His son came. That will have to be enough, and in most ways it is. Marta Solberg worked her land for another 15 years after that winter. She sold the sheep in 1901 when her health made the daily work impractical, but she kept the property and she kept the George stall maintained, checking it each autumn, repairing what needed repairing, refreshing the insulating layer on the roof every 3 years. She died in March of 1921. 11 people came to the funeral. I was one of them. Before she died, she gave the notebook to Clara Beartooth, Ruth's granddaughter, 22 years old, who had asked Marta about it the previous summer with the direct curiosity of someone who had been waiting a long time to ask a question she already knew mattered. When Clara told me what Marta had said when she gave it, I wrote it down word for word, and I have it in my ledger still, in the entry for March 1921. Marta said, "This came from Norway, but it came through this land before it came through Norway. It belongs with someone who belongs here." The reporter from Great Falls looked at his notebook and then looked at me for a moment without writing anything. I stood up from Heinrich's chair. April light was moving across the front of the store, the long horizontal light of this valley in spring, and in the middle distance across the old Abernethy field, I could see the low grass-covered mound of a George stall that had been standing for 37 years, unmaintained now, unoccupied. Still there. Last July I walked out to it. The distance is about half a mile, and it took me longer than it once would have. I stood in the entrance, both doors gone now, the frames weathered to gray, and I put my hand on the ground inside. Warmer than outside. In July, 37 years after a 57-year-old woman built it alone with salvaged timber and river sand and a dead man's notebook and the knowledge of where to dig given to her by a woman whose grandmother had known that place before any of us were born. I held my hand against the earth for a long time. The earth remembered. It was always going to remember. Marta just gave it somewhere to hold the warmth.